Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today let's do a recent reads wrap up. I have 7 books to talk to you about today for this wrap up, and at the end of this video I will be doing my TBR for the next 5 books that I plan on picking up. But let's start with the 7 books that I have finished or DNF'd. I do have 2 DNFs to talk about in this batch of 7. So we'll start with the DNFs and then we will go in the order of my least favorite book to my most favorite book. And honestly, most of these books that I'm going to talk about today are 4 stars, if I didn't DNF them, with 1 5 star. So let's get right into it. The first DNF I have is Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson. This is one where I think that this was just not for me. I actually ended up getting through quite a lot of this because I was so intrigued by the mysteries in this book that it introduced. If you don't know, Steelheart takes place in a world that has essentially become overrun with these superheroes, but they're not necessarily heroes in this story. They're very much like super villains. So you're following a character who is out for revenge against one of these villains and teams up with this group called the Reckoners to infiltrate kind of this new government that's been set up by the supervillain. And it was really, really interesting. It reminded me a lot of The Boys on Amazon, if you know that TV show. Much less gory. In this one, that show is very gory. So if you're looking for like a more PG version of The Boys, this might actually be a fantastic one for you because it really does follow kind of the darker side of what if humans had superhero-like powers. The problem was the characters in this one. I thought that this had such a strong opening and I was instantly hooked right away with the prologue. I think that the prologue was probably one of the most intense and engaging that I've read in a long time. But the problem was as the story went on and on, I found myself becoming less and less interested because of the characters. I didn't really care about any of these characters. The main character really didn't do much for me. The actual like dynamics between the characters and their dialogue just didn't really work for me. So I found myself just becoming less and less interested. And at a certain point I decided, you know what? Even though I was intrigued by the mystery, it doesn't intrigue me enough to care about these characters. So I did end up DNFing this one. I do know what happens at the end. I know about a reveal that you get in this book, and I'm honestly glad that I did not continue on because knowing that reveal, I probably would have been very frustrated with the answer to the big question in this book. So I'm not planning on continuing on with this series. But again, if you do like The Boys on Amazon, or you like those types of superhero shows and stories, this might be a really good one for you. The next DNF is a really disappointing one because I was expecting to really enjoy it and have this be like the new epic fantasy series that I was going to really get to sink my teeth into this year. And that is 12 Kings and Sharakhai by Bradley P. Beaulieu. So the issue here is very, very subjective to me as a reader. This story is a really cool one that's in this like desert fantasy world that was really interesting. And the world building was really, really fleshed out. You can really tell the author knew his world inside and out. And the problem was that with this kind of storytelling that focuses much more on the world building, I find myself becoming very uninterested in it because I really don't care. Like, I love a good world. I love cool world building with unique magic systems and that sort of thing, but I like it to accompany a plot or really fascinating characters. And this one for me just didn't have a very engaging plot to kind of carry the story forward, and it didn't have the most interesting characters. I just did not feel anything for these characters. And this is a really long book and it felt very dense to me. Like there were so many descriptions of the most mundane things that I just didn't care about, like the clothing on people's backs. We would have paragraphs to explain, or the setting in which the characters were walking into something. We would have a paragraph to explain, or a kumquat that the character was eating. We would have a paragraph to explain that. It was like everything was so detailed out that I just was not engaged at all, and I quickly lost interest. Unfortunately, every time I picked this one up, my mind would wander. I would just want to be reading something else. So I'm really bummed that this didn't work for me, because I know a ton of people love this series. So I think if you are a reader who loves fantasy worlds that are super fleshed out, that you get a lot of those descriptive details, this might really work for you. It reminded me a lot of my reading experience reading Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. That is the same kind of experience that I had, where it was so, at times, over the top descriptive that I just didn't care anymore. And so if you like Eye of the World, I'm not saying like the story or anything else about those two books, Eye of the World and this one, is similar. I'm just saying my experience reading those felt very similar. So if you like Eye of the World, maybe you would like 12 Kings of Sharakhai, based solely on the fact that my reading experience felt very similar. Huge bummer. I know a lot of people love it, but if that sounds like something that you would really enjoy, like that descriptive type fantasy world building, again, it's not that it was done bad, it just wasn't my personal preference. So I would still check this one out if it sounds really interesting to you. All right, now let's get into the books that I did manage to finish, and a lot of these are 4 stars, so I'm gonna try to pick out kind of which one is the lowest 4-star to the highest 4-star. So let's start with A Flicker in the Dark by Stacy Willingham. So this was a new release that was, I think, released in January of this year. And it follows a woman who, as a child, she discovered that her father was accused of being a serial killer who would kidnap these women and kill them. And so she kind of has now grown up with the fact that her father is in jail, accused of being this serial killer, and kind of the fallout that she had to experience growing up with that fact. And so you're following her now. She's in her adulthood. She's found a man. She's as happy as she can be, given the circumstances. But something starts happening in this community that she's in again, where there's beliefs that there might be a copycat murderer out there. I really liked the writing in this book. I thought that this book was really well constructed. And I listened to it on audiobook, and I do recommend the audiobook if you can get your hands on it. I thought the narrator did a fantastic job, and I really liked the main character. I thought that there was just enough of a balance between like moving the mystery forward while getting enough backstory about the main character and kind of her upbringing, her struggles with everything that happened with her father. So I thought that that balance was really well done. The only thing that held this back from being like amazing for me is I guessed the end. Like halfway through the book, I knew how it was going to end. And there were a couple of other things that were thrown at you that I think we're supposed to kind of put you off track, but it didn't work for me. I kind of knew exactly where it was going to go, and it did end up going there. It wasn't that it was bad or poorly written or anything like that. I actually think that the story was so well constructed that you could get there, you could get to that conclusion if you were kind of, you know, following the breadcrumbs and you were theorizing as you were reading. You could get there with the hints that the author gave, but it was still predictable, so I can't give it like a full 4.5, 5-star rating because I did guess it. I like being a little bit more surprised with my thrillers, but I did think that overall, like, the ending was still well done. Even though I knew how it was going to end, I thought it was still really well done, and kind of the journey to get there I thought was really well done. So overall, I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed how it was constructed, how it was written. It just was a little predictable, unfortunately. The next one I have is Jar of Hearts by Jennifer Hillier. This is another adult thriller that is extremely, extremely dark. Please check trigger warnings before you go into this one, because there is a lot of very graphic, disturbing imagery in this one. This one follows the story of a woman who, you're kind of in the present day timeline where she is engaged to this wealthy executive. She is doing really, really well for herself, but you find out in her childhood that her best friend had gone missing, and there were never any answers to that disappearance. She had disappeared without a trace, and now kind of 14, 16 years later, whatever it is, they find the best friend's body, and they link that disappearance to our main character, and our main character ends up becoming involved in this murder investigation. The book starts off with a bang. I think it starts off in a very, very intriguing way that hooks you straight from the first page. I thought that this book, again, was really well written, just like A Flicker in the Dark. I thought that even though there were some really disturbing things talked about in this book, I didn't think that it was necessarily like done to shock the reader or anything like that. I just thought it was really well written. It was a very well constructed story. This one, though, is just like not for the faint of heart. It was hard to say that like I enjoyed this one because it was so dark at times. It's not that it was bad, it just wasn't like an all-time favorite because I don't know that I necessarily enjoyed my time with it overall. I also think that there's a very intriguing villain in this story. The ending was really, really like intense, and I didn't really like see where it was going, and then at the end when everything comes together, it's pretty shocking. So if you like darker thrillers, this might be a really good one to pick up, but please check the content warnings before going into it because it is very dark. All right, the next one I have to talk about is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This is one I've been meaning to read for so long now, and I finally got the audiobook. The audiobook is narrated by Julia Whelan, and she is quickly becoming one of my favorite audiobook narrators. She did Malibu Rising, she did The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna, and she did this one, and all of those audiobooks I absolutely love. So if you can get your hand on the audiobook, I think that this is a really good one to listen to. This one, I feel like everyone knows kind of the gist of it because it was everywhere on BookTube last year in the community. It's a really fascinating concept, and I really, really liked exploring kind of all the different ways that would affect Addie's life. Like, you really do go into detail on like how would she afford food, how would she make money, how would she live anywhere, like all of those details are explored, which was really fascinating to see, and I really liked Addie as a character. The thing with this one that held it back from being an all-time favorite was that it just felt really long. Like it was like a 17-hour audiobook, and like I didn't feel like there was enough plot to like justify the length of this book. Like it kept going on and on and on, and we would get little snippet after snippet of like flashback from Addie living through certain time periods. It went like on and on and on, and at a certain point I was like, okay, I get it. Addie lives forever. People forget about her. Like, I get the concept. We don't have to keep explaining it over and over and over again. It felt like very long for the plot that it had. I will say, though, the character that gets introduced later on in the story was also very fascinating. Some of the nuances around that relationship were really, really interesting, and I thought the ending itself was fantastic for this one. I thought that the ending really fit the rest of the story. I loved the very, very ending, how we left off with Addie. I thought it was great. So I really liked a lot of this book, and I liked the concept, I liked the characters, the writing itself was beautiful. I just felt like it was just a little too long for what it was, if that makes sense. The last 4-star book I have to talk about was one of my most anticipated books of the entire year, and it is Kaikeyi by Vaishnavi Patel. So this one is a really cool mythology retelling of this main character Kakayi, who is from the Ramayana, which is an Indian epic, and it's kind of taking Kakayi and telling the story from her perspective, because she is very much painted as like this evil stepmother, evil queen in the original epic, and I love the way the author told this story from Kaikeyi's perspective. The story is told in first person, and I have come to realize that first person perspective is not my personal preference, but this story told in first person completely worked, and I thought that the writing style itself was absolutely stunning. Like, from the first page, I knew that I loved this writing style. I thought that the way the author described a lot of the setting and described a lot of these like time jumps, because we do follow this main character through a lot of her life, so we get a lot of time jumps in this book, and sometimes that doesn't work, but I thought it worked so well in this book. I really got a good sense of time passing, but also felt like it was balanced really well with giving us enough development during each time to feel like we really connected with the character and her journey throughout this story. Even though I loved Kaikeyi, I didn't necessarily feel the same way about a lot of the side characters. And I'll say that the first half of this book, the plot itself wasn't as engaging as the second half of this book. I think that the second half, once we get to a portion where certain characters are grown up and there's a lot of dynamics with these grown-up characters that Kakayi has a deep connection to, I thought that that part was so engaging and I was so interested in it. But the first part of this book, with the absence of those characters, wasn't as engaging as I was hoping it would be. And then I think the only other thing that affected my enjoyment just a bit was the magic in this book. I really liked exploring the magic, but I didn't feel like it played any large role in this book. Like, we kept kind of going back to it as something that I thought was going to have larger consequences down the road, or was going to play this like crucial part in the story, but it ended up not being as big of a part of the events that unfolded as I thought it was going to be. So I was a little bit torn on whether or not I liked having the focus so much on the magic system for a lot of this book, because as much as I love magic, obviously, in my fantasy books, I just wish it had maybe played a bigger role than it ended up playing. But overall, I still really enjoyed it. I highly recommend this book. I really loved the writing itself. I can't believe this is a debut novel. I will read anything else this author puts out. One definitely is one that I will continue to recommend in the future. All right, the last book I have, and my favorite of the batch, should be no surprise if you have been following this channel for a while now, and it is Age of Empyre by Michael J. Sullivan. 5 full, bright, shining stars. Like, there is no doubt that this series is now an all-time favorite. I dare to say that this is now the all-time favorite series of mine. I think it just surpassed Stormlight Archive, which I'm like shocked. I didn't know that that was going to happen. I'm genuinely shocked that I feel so passionately about this series. It was amazing. It was amazing. I loved every second of it. And even looking back at the first book, which I gave 4.5 stars instead of 5, I think if I went back and reread it, it would be easy 5 stars. I just love every step of this journey. If I'm dethroning Stormlight Archive, I have to talk a little bit about why. And I think, one, Stormlight Archive isn't done, so it's hard to say that that's my all-time favorite if I don't know whether or not it sticks the landing, and this one for sure did. The landing was stuck, it was beautiful, it was magnificent. I loved this ending. I know that there are probably some flaws, I know that everything wasn't absolutely perfect, but I loved it. I loved it so much, and it was so emotional. I felt like every character just, it made sense. It made sense why it ended the way it did. It made me cry. It was beautiful. I loved it. I think that the other thing this series does so incredibly well is it tells the story in just the right amount of pages, where each of these books is about, like, I would say between 350 and 450 pages, which for fantasy books is not long. For fantasy books, that's actually on the shorter side, I would say. And even though there are 6 books in this series, each book is about 400 pages. So you actually don't waste a lot of time. Every paragraph, every step of the way feels like it's crucial to the story because of the length of each book. And I think that, you know, with other fantasy books that are humongous, that I love, like I love Stormlight Archive, and each book is like 1,000 pages. There are times where it drags, right? Because the story is not going to be the same pacing, the same amount of engaging, all 4,000 pages that we have to read through. Versus, I think this series does such a fantastic job of pacing and does such a good job of packing so much into a 400-page novel. So I love the pacing of this series. The characters are some of my all-time favorites, and it's not just 1 or 2 characters, it's the entire cast of characters. And I think that that's a big difference as well. Whereas a lot of my other favorites that are on my fantasy list, it's like 1 or 2 characters are all-time favorites. This is the entire cast. I love them all. Like, they're amazing. So for that reason, I feel really confident in saying that this is my all-time favorite fantasy series right now. It's just fantastic. And again, like, I know that there are probably flaws. I don't care. I do not care. I love this series. So if I haven't convinced you to at least try it, I don't know what else I can say. But at least try this series, because you might be so surprised like I was. I was not expecting this to be like an all-time favorite series, let alone the all-time favorite series of mine. So I was just so pleasantly surprised every step of the way, and I love it so much. So if you pick it up, you'll have to let me know what you think of it, and I hope you end up loving it as much as I did, because this was just such a roller coaster ride of emotions, and I'm so, so glad that it stuck the landing. Those are all the books that I have in this wrap-up to talk about. Now let's talk about the next 5 books that I plan on picking up and will be featured most likely in my next wrap-up. All right, let's start with books that I've already started. The first one being The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. I just got the audiobook through my library, so I've already started it. I'm about 15% of the way through the audiobook, so still too early to have any sort of deep thoughts on this one, but so far I am enjoying it. I really like the writing. Tiger and the Wolf by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This was the shelf space pick for May. I am super behind on it. It is very large and slowly making my way through it. I unfortunately am not loving this one as much as I thought I was going to, especially since Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky ended up being one of my all-time favorite fantasy books. This is just not quite as engaging as I was hoping. So I'm about 200 pages in, and I don't know if I'm gonna finish it. I just don't know. So we'll see about this one, but it should hopefully be featured in the next wrap-up. Next one I have, I'm about 1/3 of the way through, and that's Blood Heir by Amelie Wenzel. I feel like I've been reading this one forever, and it's not because it's bad, it's just I have other like commitment stuff that I have to read, but I'm really liking it. So hopefully we'll have thoughts for you on the full book during the next wrap-up. And a couple other books that I haven't yet started, but definitely planning on getting to as soon as I finish up a couple of those other ones. Rise of Empyre by Michael J. Sullivan. I read Theft of Swords in January or December? Anyways, so I read the first bind-up of the first 2 books in the Ryaria Revelations, and I kind of want to go back and reread some of the first 2 books, because now that I finished Legends of the First Empire, I bet there's a bunch of Easter eggs that I didn't pick up on. But I'm definitely planning on continuing my way through this whole series that Michael J. Sullivan has created. I just am obsessed with this world, so can't wait to get back into it. And then finally, we have Electra by Jennifer Saint. I know I said I was going to hopefully have this one finished by this wrap-up, and unfortunately just got bogged down with a couple of other commitments, so hoping to read and complete Electra soon so I can have a good review for you. I am very excited to read this one. I again want to read more mythology retellings this year, so very excited to check this one out. I know that it is, I think, out now. Yes, May 3rd, so I'm a little bit behind on my review. I'm so sorry, but hopefully we'll have this one done soon. That's everything I have for you today. Did you see any books that you want to comment on? Leave those comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye!